To the world, he is the royal explorer, Prince Luigi Amedeo. A man without fear, he faces avalanches, polar bears, and the unknown. He has conquered ice, rocks, and the highest mountains. But there is one thing he fears most: his cousin, the King of Italy. Because while the prince has conquered the world, the king holds power over the one thing he desires most: the woman he loves. Why is the bravest explorer in the world not allowed to marry the woman of his choice? This is the story of a man who can travel to the ends of the earth, but is denied the happiness that is right in front of his eyes. To understand the Duke's extraordinary choices, we must first understand the extraordinary world that shaped him, a period marked by Italy's recent unification and the broader global dynamics of imperialism, technological progress, and exploratory ambition at the turn of the 20th century. He was a prince of the House of Savoy, the ancient dynasty originating in the 11th century as counts in the Alpine region, which had expanded through centuries of strategic alliances, military conquests, and political maneuvering to become the ruling family of the Kingdom of Sardinia by the 18th century. The House of Savoy played a central role in the Risorgimento, the 19th century movement for Italian unification, led by figures like Count Camillo di Cavour, who as Prime Minister of Sardinia orchestrated alliances with France to defeat Austria in the 1859 Second War of Italian Independence, securing Lombardy, and supported Giuseppe Garibaldi's 1860 Expedition of the Thousand to conquer the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. This culminated in the proclamation of the Kingdom of Italy in 1861, with Victor Emmanuel II, Luigi Amedeo's grandfather, as its first king, incorporating regions from Venice, acquired in 1866 after the Third War of Independence allied with Prussia, to Rome, captured from the Papal States in 1870, becoming the capital in 1871. But he was also a man of the fin de siècle, the turn of the 20th century, from approximately 1890 to 1914, an era characterized by a mix of cultural decadence, artistic innovation in movements like Art Nouveau and symbolism, and societal optimism tempered by underlying anxieties about modernity, as seen in the works of philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche, who proclaimed the death of God in 1882, influencing intellectual debates on morality and power. His Italy was a nation in the first flush of youth, having emerged from centuries of division under foreign domination, Austrian in the north, Spanish Bourbon in the south, and Papal in the center, into a unified state covering 301,340 square kilometers, with a population of 32 million by 1901, but grappling with economic disparities between the industrialized north and the agrarian, impoverished south, where latifundia systems perpetuated poverty and spurred mass immigration of over 4 million Italians to the Americas between 1880 and 1914. This new Kingdom of Italy was filled with the immense pride of a nation reborn, but also with the deep anxiety of a latecomer to the great game of European power, investing in infrastructure like the 1871 Frejus rail tunnel connecting to France and the 1882 Gotthard tunnel to Switzerland, facilitating trade while facing challenges like the 1887 Bava Beccaris massacre in Milan, where troops killed 80 protesters during bread riots, highlighting social unrest. It was desperate to take its place at the top table of European powers, alongside the established giants of Britain, France, and the German Empire. To do this, Italy needed to be modern, strong, and respected, pursuing colonial expansion in Africa with the 1885 occupation of Massawa in Eritrea, and the 1890 establishment of Italian Somaliland. Though suffering setbacks like the 1896 Battle of Adwa, defeat by Ethiopia, where 6,000 Italian troops died, prompting a re-evaluation of military strategy. The royal family was the living symbol of this new national unity and ambition, with King Umberto I, reigned 1878 to 1900, promoting symbols like the 1880 monument to Victor Emmanuel II in Rome and supporting cultural institutions such as the 1895 Venice Biennale to showcase Italian art. A prince, therefore, could not afford to be a mere playboy, indulging in the era's aristocratic leisure like gambling at Monte Carlo or yachting in the Riviera. He had a duty to embody the strength and vitality of the new Italy through public service, military excellence, or achievements that enhance national prestige, as exemplified by Prince Emanuele Filiberto, Luigi's brother, who commanded armies in World War I. At the same time, the world was gripped by the heroic age of exploration, a term describing the period from about 1897 to 1922, when adventurers undertook perilous journeys to remote regions using rudimentary equipment, driven by a mix of scientific inquiry, personal glory, and national competition in an age before aircraft and radio made such feats more accessible. While the great continents had been largely carved up by the colonial powers, Africa partitioned at the Berlin Conference with 90% under European control by 1900. Asia divided among Britain, Russia, and France, and the Americas independent but economically dominated. The final, most glorious prizes remained unclaimed, attracting explorers funded by geographical societies and governments. The crushing ice of the North and South Poles presented extreme challenges. The Arctic's average winter temperatures of minus 40 degrees Celsius, shifting pack ice up to 15 meters thick, and months of darkness, as experienced in Adolphus Greely's 1881 to 1884 Lady Franklin Bay expedition, where 19 of 25 men died from starvation. The South Pole's Antarctic plateau, with elevations over 2,800 meters and winds exceeding 200 kilometers per hour, remained untouched until Ernest Shackleton's 1907 to 1909 Nimrod expedition reached within 156 kilometers. The forbidding oxygen-starved summits of the world's highest mountains, concentrated in the Himalayas and Karakoram ranges, posed risks of altitude sickness, acute mountain sickness affecting 50% above 3,500 meters, avalanches, and technical climbing on vertical ice walls, as seen in Albert Mummery's 1,895 fatal try on Nanga Parbat, 8,126 meters. For nations and for individuals, reaching these places was the ultimate test of courage, endurance, and technological prowess, requiring innovations like Nansen's specially designed Fram ship for ice drift in 1893 to 1896, or oxygen apparatus prototyped by Alexander Calas in 1921 for Everest. It was the space race of its day, with rivalries like the British-Norwegian contest for the South Pole in 1911 to 1912, where Amundsen's use of dogs versus Scott's ponies and man-hauling determined success, and its heroes were men like the Norwegian Fridtjof Nansen, who crossed Greenland's ice cap in 1888 on skis, covering 470 kilometers in 49 days and pioneering polar nutrition with pemmican, or the American Robert Peary, who claimed the North Pole on April 6, 1909, after 7 attempts since 1891, traversing 1,300 kilometers of ice with Inuit guides and dogs, though his claim was contested by Frederick Cook's 1908 assertion, sparking debates resolved in Peary's favor by the U.S. Congress in 1911. These explorers were global celebrities. Their exploits followed breathlessly by millions through newspapers and telegraphs, with lectures by men like Nansen drawing thousands and books by adventurers like Peary becoming bestsellers. This was the pantheon of heroes a young Prince Luigi Amedeo was preparing to join. While his path began with royal tradition, joining the Navy at the age of 6 in 1879, he pursued it with true professional dedication, entering the Naval Academy in Livorno in 1887. He would graduate at the top of his class in 1892, armed with an expert knowledge of hydrography and astronomy, the very skills that would form the scientific bedrock of his future fame. The Navy itself was a potent symbol of the New Italy's ambitions. A modern, steel-clad fleet expanded from 40 warships in 1870 to 100 by 1900, including battleships like the Italia class. Displacement 15,000 tons, speed 18 knots. Designed to project power in the Mediterranean against France and Austria, Hungary, and support colonial interests in Africa, such as the 1895 to 1896 Abyssinian campaign. The Duke excelled, rapidly rising through the ranks from midshipman in 1892 to lieutenant in 1895 and captain in 1905, serving on the cruiser Vetter Pisani for 1893 to 1894, circumnavigation visiting 20 ports, and proving himself a brilliant navigator during monsoons in the Indian Ocean, using dead reckoning to avoid reefs, and a respected commander of men implementing hygiene reforms that reduced scurvy incidents on long voyages. But the structured life of the Navy, with its drills like fleet reviews off La Spezia, and disciplines such as gunnery practice with 305mm cannons, could not contain his ambition for independent command. He saw his naval skills not as an end, but as the key that could unlock the door to the world's wildest places, applying seamanship to polar navigation and leadership to expedition-wise teams. He devoured the accounts of the great explorers and mountaineers of his day, subscribing to journals like the Bollettino della Società Geografica Italiana and studying Nansen's Farthest North, 1897, for ice drift techniques, and began to dream of his own expeditions, sketching plans for Arctic voyages in 1895 notebooks. He possessed a unique combination of advantages: the physical toughness and leadership skills of a naval officer, honed through years at sea, enduring gales and commanding diverse crews of 200 sailors; the scientific mind of a geographer, self-taught in meteorology and cartography through academy courses and personal studies at the Hydrographic Institute in Genoa; and the royal status that gave him the unique power to command the attention and the funding needed for his incredibly expensive ventures, securing 100,000 lire from the Italian government for his 1897 Mount St. Elias climb, and patronage from King Umberto I for equipment. Having proven himself a capable naval officer, the Duke of the Abruzzi now turned the full force of his formidable ambition towards the great unconquered frontiers of the world. For him, exploration wasn't a hobby, it was a science and a passion. He planned his expeditions with the same meticulous precision he would use for a naval campaign, leaving nothing to chance. In 1897, he announced his first major objective, a goal so audacious that it immediately captured the world's attention: the first ascent of Mount St. Elias. Looming over the border of Alaska and Canada, Mount St. Elias was a terrifying giant of ice and rock. At over 18,000 feet, it was the second highest peak in North America and was notorious for its horrific weather and treacherous, unstable glaciers. It had repelled numerous well-funded American and British expeditions, earning a reputation for being utterly unconquerable. For the young Duke, that was precisely the appeal. Success here would be an unambiguous statement of intent. He assembled a dream team, including the legendary mountain photographer Vittorio Sella and the finest alpine guides from Italy's Aosta Valley. After sailing to Alaska, they faced a grueling overland trek just to reach the base of the mountain. They were venturing into a true wilderness, navigating dense forests and crossing raging glacier-fed rivers. The climb itself was a brutal, relentless assault against the mountain. They spent weeks slowly forging a route up the vast Newton Glacier, roped together, constantly probing for hidden crevasses that could swallow a man without a trace. They were battered by storms and suffered from the debilitating effects of high altitude. But the Duke's leadership was unwavering. Finally, on the 31st of July, 1897, they stood on the summit. The Italian flag was planted on one of North America's most difficult peaks. The Duke returned to international acclaim. He was no longer just a prince, he was a world-class mountaineer. But even the triumph on Mount St. Elias was merely a stepping stone. In 1899, the Duke launched an expedition that was grander and far more dangerous than anything he had attempted before, a journey to the North Pole. On his ship, the Stella Polare, he sailed into the Arctic Ocean, deliberately allowing the vessel to be frozen into the polar ice pack. The plan was to use the trapped ship as a winter base, from which a hand-picked team would make a final dash for the pole by dog sled in the spring. The Arctic winter was an ordeal of almost unimaginable hardship. For months, the men lived in total darkness, enduring extreme cold and the constant, terrifying sound of the ice squeezing the hull of their ship. The Stella Polare was nearly crushed, its timbers splintering under the immense pressure. It was during this brutal winter that the Duke's personal ambition met a cruel fate. While on a reconnaissance trip to test their equipment, he was caught in a severe blizzard. His hands were badly frozen, and by the time he made it back to the ship, the damage was irreversible. The expedition's doctor delivered the devastating news. To save his hands, the top joints of 2 of his fingers had to be amputated. For the Duke, this was more than a physical injury. It was the end of his dream of being the first man to stand at the top of the world. He would be unable to lead the final polar dash. A lesser leader might have abandoned the entire expedition, but the Duke's commitment to the mission was greater than his desire for personal glory. He made a selfless and crucial decision. He appointed his most trusted officer, Captain Umberto Cagni, to lead the sledging party in his place. In the spring of 1900, as the Duke recovered on the crippled ship, Cagni and his team set off across the frozen ocean. Their journey was a 104-day ordeal of suffering and survival. They battled shifting ice ridges, open leads of water, and near starvation as their rations dwindled and their sled dogs perished one by one. They did not reach the pole, but on the 25th of April, they achieved their other great objective. They reached a latitude of 86 degrees and 34 minutes north. They had shattered the previous record and had traveled farther north than any human in history. When they finally staggered back to the Stella Polare, they were greeted as heroes. The expedition had succeeded not through the Duke's personal achievement, but through his leadership and his unshakable will. After his return, the Duke continued his explorations, shifting his focus to science and mapping. In 1906, he led a landmark expedition to the Ruwenzori Mountains in Uganda. the legendary Mountains of the Moon, whose snow-capped peaks had been a source of mystery since the time of the ancient Greeks. His team didn't just climb, they conducted the first comprehensive scientific survey of the entire range, mapping its glaciers, documenting its unique flora and fauna, and making first ascents of all its major peaks. Then, in 1909, he returned to the Himalayas for his ultimate climbing challenge, K2. While Everest is higher, K2, the Savage Mountain, is universally acknowledged by climbers as the far more difficult and dangerous peak. The Duke launched a massive, brilliantly organized expedition to attempt it. For weeks, his team explored the mountain's complex and treacherous approaches. They pushed as high as they could, battling extreme altitude and ferocious storms, but were ultimately turned back by the mountain's sheer technical difficulty. It seemed like a failure. But even in defeat, the Duke left his most enduring mark. The route that his team scouted and attempted on the mountain's southeast ridge was so perfectly chosen that it remains over a century later the standard and most frequently used route to the summit. To this day, mountaineers from around the world know it by one name, the Abruzzi Spur. He never stood on top of K2, but he showed the way for everyone who followed. He had conquered the useless places of the world, the peaks and the poles that offered no gold or riches, only the pure satisfaction of discovery, and in doing so, had become a legend. At the turn of the 20th century, the North Pole was far more than just a point on a map. It was a place of myth and legend, a blank space that represented the final unconquered frontier of human discovery. For the ambitious nations of the era, the race to be the first to stand at 90 degrees north was the ultimate test of national will, technological prowess, and human endurance. It was the great obsession of the age, and its arena was a terrifying, shifting landscape of ice, blizzard, and perpetual twilight. At the center of this great international contest stood three colossal figures, each representing a different approach to this ultimate challenge: a brilliant Norwegian scientist, a relentless American adventurer, and the Italian prince who dared to challenge them both. The man who redefined the entire game was the Norwegian explorer and visionary Fridtjof Nansen. Before Nansen, expeditions had tried to fight their way through the polar ice, a battle they always lost. Nansen had a revolutionary idea: don't fight the ice, use it. He had observed that driftwood from Siberia washed up on the shores of Greenland, concluding that a powerful current must flow across the Arctic Ocean. He built an extraordinary ship, the Fram, with a reinforced, rounded hull designed not to be crushed by the ice but to be lifted up by it. In 1893, he deliberately sailed the Fram into the ice pack off the coast of Siberia and began a 3-year journey, trapped in the ice, hoping the natural drift would carry him over the pole. While the Fram's drift didn't pass directly over the pole, Nansen made his own daring dash. With a single companion, Hjalmar Johansen, he left the ship and set out on skis and with dog sleds. They didn't reach the pole, but in 1895 they reached a latitude of 86 degrees and 14 minutes north. It was a new world record for farthest north. Nansen's scientific approach and his incredible journey electrified the world and set the new benchmark for all who would follow. He had proven that it was possible to survive the Arctic winter and to travel deep into the polar sea. It was Nansen's record that the Duke of the Abruzzi was determined to break. The Duke's 1899 expedition on the Stella Polare was a direct response to the Norwegian's triumph, but with a distinctly Italian approach. He learned from Nansen, building a ship that could also withstand the ice, but his plan was a hybrid of Nansen's method and the more traditional approach. Instead of a passive drift, the Duke would use his ship as a forward operating base for a direct, powerful assault on the pole by multiple well-supplied dog sled teams. His expedition was a model of royal patronage and national ambition. It was larger, better funded, and equipped with the very latest scientific instruments. This was Italy announcing its arrival in the Premier League of exploration. As we know, the Duke's personal dream of leading the final assault was tragically cut short by frostbite. But his reaction to this disaster is what sets his expedition apart. Where other expeditions, so often driven by the single-minded ego of their leaders, might have collapsed, the Duke's leadership transformed a personal failure into a collective triumph. His decision to pass command to Captain Umberto Cagni was a testament to his focus on the mission's goal above his own. Cagni's subsequent journey was a brutal epic, a testament to the superb planning and endurance of the Italian team. When his party finally reached their limit, planting the Italian flag at 86 degrees and 34 minutes north, they had decisively beaten Nansen's record by about 20 miles. It was a huge victory. The news, when it finally reached the outside world, was a sensation. An Italian prince, on his first attempt, had surpassed the legendary Nansen and claimed the coveted farthest north title for his country. But there was another, even more relentless figure in this great race, the American naval officer, Robert Peary. While Nansen was the scientist and the Duke was the royal professional, Peary was the obsessive. For decades, the North Pole was his singular, all-consuming goal. His methods were very different from the Europeans. He spent years living with the native Inuit of Greenland, adopting their survival techniques, their fur clothing, and their expert dog handling skills. His expeditions were less about large European teams and more about small mobile units, heavily reliant on the indispensable knowledge of his Inuit guides, men like Matthew Henson. Peary was a controversial figure. He was secretive, notoriously difficult to work with, and often seen as a glory hunter who was less interested in science than in the prize itself. He viewed the Duke's successful expedition with intense jealousy, seeing the Italian prince as a wealthy amateur encroaching on his territory. The rivalry between the two camps was palpable, yet it was Peary who would eventually make the ultimate claim. In 1909, years after the Duke's expedition, Peary announced that he had finally reached the North Pole. It was a claim, however, that would be shrouded in controversy for the next century, with many experts questioning the accuracy of his navigation and the speeds he claimed to have achieved. In this context, the Duke of the Abruzzi's achievement stands out for its clarity and professionalism. He may not have been the first to claim the pole, but he was the first to decisively break the great Nansen's record. His expedition was a triumph of meticulous planning, scientific rigor, and a selfless style of leadership. His record was undisputed, a clear and verifiable milestone in the great human quest to reach the top of the world. In the golden, heroic age of polar exploration, when giants from Norway and America dominated the headlines, the prince from the warm heart of the Mediterranean proved that he could journey into the frozen wasteland at the edge of the world and go farther than them all. By 1907, the Duke of the Abruzzi was more than just a prince or an explorer. He had risen to prominence through a series of daring expeditions that captured international attention. At 34 years old, he was handsome, with sharp features, piercing blue eyes, and an athletic build honed by years at sea and in the mountains, a celebrated hero whose exploits were chronicled in best-selling books like On the Polar Star in the Arctic Sea, 1903, translated into multiple languages and selling over 50,000 copies in Europe alone. He was arguably the world's most eligible bachelor, linked in gossip columns to various European noblewomen but remaining unattached, his status as a Savoy prince making him a symbol of Italian vitality in an era when the young kingdom sought global recognition through cultural and exploratory achievements. Having returned from his triumphant expedition to Africa's Mountains of the Moon, where his team's surveys corrected Ptolemy's ancient maps and collected over 200 geological specimens, he embarked on a tour of the United States in late 1907, invited by American geographical societies and industrialists eager to host the renowned explorer. The tour included lectures at venues like the National Geographic Society in Washington, D.C., where he spoke to audiences of 1,000 on polar navigation techniques, and visits to New York and Chicago, where newspapers like the New York Times hailed him as Italy's modern Columbus. It was here, in the bustling, confident capital of Washington, D.C., amid receptions at the White House under President Theodore Roosevelt, who shared the Duke's passion for adventure, having led the Rough Riders in 1898, that the man who had conquered mountains and ice fields would meet the one person who would change his life forever, a meeting that sparked a romance blending old world royalty with new world independence. Her name was Catherine Elkins, often called Kitty by those close to her, a 21-year-old socialite whose poise and intellect made her a standout in Washington's elite circles. She was the daughter of Stephen Benton Elkins, a powerful Republican senator from West Virginia since 1895, who had amassed a fortune through railroads, coal mining, and lumber, building an empire that included the Elkins Coal and Coke Company, producing millions of tons annually and employing thousands in the Appalachian region. Stephen Elkins, born in 1841, had served as Secretary of War under President Benjamin Harrison from 1891 to 1893, overseeing military reforms, and his influence extended to foreign policy, advocating for American expansionism in the Spanish-American War of 1898. Catherine's mother, Hallie Davis Elkins, came from a prominent Virginia family, adding Southern charm to the household. The Elkins family represented America's new Gilded Age aristocracy, a dynasty of industrial and political power, not ancient blood, emblematic of the era's self-made millionaires like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, whose wealth dwarfed European nobility. Raised in luxury at their Washington mansion on K Street and the sprawling Halliehurst estate in Elkins, West Virginia, a 60-room Tudor revival home built in 1891 with oak paneling and stained glass windows, Catherine was educated at private schools in the U.S. and Europe, fluent in French, German, and Italian, and trained in etiquette at finishing schools in Paris. She was not a demure European princess bound by court protocols and arranged marriages. Instead, she embodied the emerging American woman of the progressive era, influenced by figures like Jane Addams and the suffrage movement led by Susan B. Anthony, which gained momentum with the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, showcasing women's achievements. Catherine was intelligent, with a keen interest in literature and history, often quoting Shakespeare or discussing Theodore Roosevelt's conservation policies at social gatherings. She was vibrant, known for her lively conversations at White House dinners and charity balls, where her dark hair, bright eyes, and elegant gowns from Worth of Paris turned heads. Possessed of a modern American spirit of independence, she traveled unchaperoned to Europe in 1905, visiting relatives in England and attending operas in Milan, and advocated for women's education in private letters to her father. She was a brilliant horsewoman, competing in equestrian events at the Chevy Chase Club in Maryland, winning ribbons for jumping and dressage, and spoke several languages with ease, using them to correspond with international friends. She moved with a confidence that captivated everyone she met, a trait honed by her father's political salons, where she debated with senators like Henry Cabot Lodge on imperialism, her poise reflecting the era's Gibson girl ideal, independent, athletic, and intellectually engaged, as popularized by illustrator Charles Dana Gibson in the 1890s. Their first meeting was electric, occurring in December 1907 at a formal dinner hosted by Senator Elkins at his Washington residence, arranged after the Duke's lecture at the National Geographic Society, where Elkins, a society member, extended an invitation to discuss exploration's role in national strength. The event, attended by 50 guests including diplomats and Roosevelt administration officials, featured a menu of oyster cocktails, roast turkey, and champagne toast to Italian-American friendship. Seated next to each other, the Duke and Catherine engaged in animated conversation. He shared stories of his Arctic ordeal, describing the -40 °C temperatures and the aurora borealis that lit his sledge journeys, while she recounted her horseback rides through West Virginia's mountains, drawing parallels to his alpine climbs. The dashing, worldly Italian prince, with his tales of surviving on pemmican and dog sledding 500 kilometers, and the beautiful, fiercely intelligent American heiress, with her questions about glacial formations and polar navigation, were immediately drawn to each other, their chemistry noted by guests like the Italian ambassador, who reported back to Rome on the instant rapport. It was a classic encounter between the old world and the new, where the Duke represented Europe's hereditary nobility, with its emphasis on duty, tradition, and exploration as a royal obligation, while Catherine embodied America's meritocratic energy, where success was earned through initiative and innovation, free from rigid class structures. He was fascinated by her wit, which sparkled in debates on women's roles in society. She argued for suffrage, citing the 1906 Finnish Parliament's inclusion of women, challenging his more conservative views shaped by Italy's patriarchal court, and her freedom from the stiff conventions of the European courts he knew so well, where princesses like his cousin Elena of Montenegro were confined to protocol and arranged marriages. In contrast, Catherine's independence allowed her to pursue interests like photography, capturing images of Appalachian landscapes, and philanthropy, supporting the American Red Cross founded by Clara Barton in 1881. She was charmed by his quiet charisma, a understated confidence born from leading men through life-threatening dangers, his heroic reputation as the first to climb the Matterhorn's Zmutt Ridge in 1894, and the depth that lay behind his piercing blue eyes, which conveyed a thoughtful introspection, rare among royals accustomed to superficial interactions. Their dialogue extended late into the evening, discussing shared passions like literature. Both admired Rudyard Kipling's Kim, 1901, for its adventure themes, and the future of exploration, with Catherine suggesting American funding for his ventures, foreshadowing their emotional bond. What followed was an intense romance that quickly became the talk of international society, unfolding over the next 5 years with an intensity that fueled newspaper headlines and diplomatic gossip across 2 continents. The press on both sides of the Atlantic was enthralled by this real-life fairy tale, with the New York Times running front-page stories like Duke of Abruzzi courts American heiress in January 1908, detailing their outings and speculating on marriage, while Italian papers like Corriere della Sera portrayed it as a symbol of transatlantic alliance. Newspapers breathlessly chronicled their every move. A visit by the Duke to the Elkins family's sprawling estate in West Virginia in February 1908, Hallihurst, a 7,000-acre property with manicured lawns, stables for 50 horses, and a private railroad station where they spent days riding through the Allegheny Mountains, sharing stories of his African climbs and her childhood hunts. During this stay, the Duke gifted Catherine a sapphire brooch from his family's collection, symbolizing his growing affection, and they exchanged letters daily when apart, with his missives describing his longing for her vibrant spirit amid naval duties. A shared love for the outdoors bonded them further. In summer 1908, they hiked in the Swiss Alps during Catherine's European tour, where the Duke taught her basic mountaineering techniques like ice axe use, and she impressed him with her endurance on trails near Zermatt. A series of discreet meetings across Europe followed. In Paris in 1909 at the Ritz Hotel, where they attended the Ballet Russe premiere of Scheherazade, discussing art and culture late into the night. In London in 1910 at Claridge's, hosted by British relatives, where they walked in Hyde Park, evading photographers, and in Rome at the Quirinal Palace in 1911, where Catherine met the Italian royal family, charming Queen Elena with her Italian fluency. The public was smitten with the idea of the celebrated royal explorer finding his true love with the brilliant American beauty, as magazines like Harper's Bazaar featured illustrations of their fairy tale romance, and society columns in the Washington Post described Catherine's gowns. At balls attended with the Duke, such as a white satin dress embroidered with pearls at a 1908 White House reception. For the Duke, this was no mere dalliance, a fleeting affair common among royals like his uncle King Umberto I's mistresses. It was a profound and passionate connection that challenged his solitary explorer's life, as he confided in letters to his brother Emanuele Filiberto his desire for a partner who understands the call of the unknown, yet grounds me in love. He proposed marriage in 1909 during a private dinner in Venice, offering a diamond ring from the Savoy jewels, and Catherine accepted with tears, envisioning a life blending his adventures with her American independence. The romance's depth was evident in their correspondence, preserved in family archives where the Duke wrote of Catherine's wit that lights my path like the polar sun, and she responded with admiration for his courage that inspires my own dreams. Their shared interests strengthened the bond. Both loved horses, competing in amateur races, he in naval steeplechases, she in Virginia fox hunts, and discussed books like Jack London's Call of the Wild, 1903, relating it to his polar experiences. The relationship faced obstacles from the start, with royal protocols requiring morganatic marriage approval for a non-royal like Catherine, and her father's initial skepticism about European nobility, but their commitment persisted through secret rendezvous, such as a 1910 cruise on the Duke's yacht off the Amalfi Coast, where they planned a future of joint travels to unexplored lands. The proposal in 1909 was not impulsive. It followed months of courtship, with the Duke seeking permission from King Victor Emmanuel III, his cousin, who initially hesitated due to Catherine's non-Catholic faith, but relented under the romance's popularity. Catherine's acceptance was heartfelt, as she wrote to her mother of finding a soulmate who sees beyond titles to the heart. The engagement, announced unofficially in newspapers like The Times in 1909, sparked global interest, with Italian crowds cheering the Duke upon return, viewing it as a modern union symbolizing Italy's transatlantic ties. But their romance was about to collide with the rigid traditions of the Italian monarchy, an obstacle more formidable than any mountain he had ever faced. As a prince of the royal house of Savoy, Luigi Amedeo was not a private citizen. He could not marry whom he pleased. He first required the official permission of the head of his family, his cousin, King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy. Confident in his status as a national hero and in the power of his love, the Duke formally requested the king's consent. The answer was an absolute and devastating no. The king's objection was not personal, it was dynastic. Catherine Elkins, for all her wealth, intelligence, and charm, was a commoner in the eyes of the ancient Italian monarchy. A marriage between a prince of the blood and a person of non-royal rank was known as a morganatic marriage. While permissible for minor royals, it was unthinkable for a man like the Duke, who was high in the line of succession. The unwritten law was clear. A morganatic wife could not share her husband's royal titles or status, and, most critically, their children would be completely excluded from the line of succession. For King Victor Emmanuel III, a man obsessed with dynastic duty, this was a direct threat to the monarchy itself. He believed that allowing a senior prince to marry a commoner would undermine the foundation of royal authority. It would dilute the royal bloodline and set a dangerous precedent that could unravel centuries of tradition. He also harbored political fears that an American daughter-in-law with such a powerful father could create an unwelcome channel of foreign influence right at the heart of the Italian court. The Duke was heartbroken and enraged. He pleaded with his cousin, arguing that the world was changing and that love should matter more than ancient, stuffy protocols. There is a widely reported account of their confrontation in which the Duke, in a moment of desperate passion, told the king, "I have faced death 1,000 times, and I am not afraid of anything but to live without her." But the king was unmoved. For him, this wasn't about romance. It was a cold calculation to ensure the survival of his dynasty. He presented the Duke with a brutal, life-altering choice. He could have Catherine, but only if he renounced everything else. He would have to give up his title as Duke of the Abruzzi, his rank as an admiral in the Navy, his royal allowance, his place in the line of succession, and effectively his life as a Prince of Italy. He would have to go into exile, a private citizen, stripped of the identity he had carried since birth. The choice was agonizing. The Duke was a modern man, but he was also the product of his upbringing. The code of duty to his family and his nation was woven into the very fiber of his being. To abandon it all, even for the woman he loved, felt like a betrayal of everything he was. For months, he and Catherine lived in a state of tormented limbo, hoping the king might change his mind. But the pressure from the court was immense. Finally, facing the impossible choice, the couple made the heartbreaking decision to end their engagement. The fairy tale was over. The international press was full of speculation, but the true painful reason was kept within the silent walls of the palace. The loss would shadow the Duke for the rest of his life. He threw himself back into his work with a renewed, almost manic intensity, but those who knew him saw a change. A certain light had gone out of his eyes. He became a more solitary, more remote figure. He never married. And across the ocean, Catherine Elkins, the woman who had captured the hero's heart, also remained unmarried for the rest of her life. The man who could conquer the most savage mountains and the most remote seas had been defeated by the unyielding traditions of his own home. He had proven he was master of the natural world, but he was still a captive of the gilded cage into which he was born. The heartbroken Duke returned from America and threw himself back into the only other life he knew, his duty to the Italian Royal Navy. The golden age of exploration was ending, and a new, darker era was beginning in Europe, one that would be defined not by discovery, but by destruction. When the Great War erupted in 1914, Italy initially remained neutral, but in 1915, it joined the conflict on the side of the Allies against its former partners, Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. For the Italian Navy, the primary enemy was the powerful Austro-Hungarian fleet, which was largely based in heavily fortified ports along the Croatian coast. The strategic situation was perilous. The Italian coast was long, flat, and vulnerable to attack, while the enemy's coast was a natural fortress of islands and deep inlets. There was only one man with the prestige, experience, and popular acclaim to lead the Italian fleet in this crucial theater of war. Prince Luigi Amedeo, Duke of the Abruzzi, was appointed commander-in-chief of the Adriatic fleet. He was now in his 40s, his adventuring days behind him. He traded his explorer's parka for an admiral's uniform, and the responsibility on his shoulders was immense. He was no longer leading a small team of hand-picked experts. He was commanding a massive fleet of modern dreadnoughts, cruisers, destroyers, and tens of thousands of sailors. The Duke proved to be a formidable and energetic commander. He immediately implemented a strategy to contain the enemy. His most significant achievement was the Otranto Barrage, a vast naval blockade of the Strait of Otranto, the narrow channel at the mouth of the Adriatic Sea. By laying minefields and maintaining constant patrols of destroyers and armed drifters, his fleet effectively sealed the Austro-Hungarian Navy, and most critically, its submarines inside the Adriatic. This was a vital contribution to the Allied war effort, protecting shipping lanes throughout the Mediterranean. He also used his smaller, faster torpedo boats, the famous MAS boats, to conduct daring hit-and-run raids on enemy harbors. However, the Duke's aggressive spirit soon brought him into conflict with the political leadership in Rome and even some of his Allied counterparts. He was a man of action who believed in seeking a decisive confrontation. He wanted to lure the main Austro-Hungarian fleet out of its ports for a single, decisive sea battle that would secure Italy's naval supremacy in the Adriatic. But the High Command was terrified of this prospect. Their expensive modern battleships were symbols of national power, and they were terrified of losing them. They preferred a much more cautious strategy, known as the fleet in being. The idea was to keep their own fleet safe in port, where its mere existence would tie down enemy forces. For the Duke, this was a frustrating and he felt cowardly doctrine. This fundamental clash of strategies between his desire for bold action and the government's preference for cautious preservation created immense tension. This tension, combined with professional jealousies and political infighting, would ultimately seal his fate as a commander. His royal status, once an asset, now made him a target for ambitious rivals in the Navy and politicians in Rome, who resented his influence. In 1917, following a major military disaster on land at the Battle of Caporetto, which sent the nation into a crisis, his enemies saw their chance. He was made a scapegoat for the Navy's inability to achieve a spectacular victory and was controversially relieved of his command. It was a bitter and humiliating end to his distinguished military career. After serving his country with skill and dedication, he was pushed aside. After the war, the Duke found himself a man adrift. He was in his 50s, the world he had known was gone, and his great love was lost to him forever. He needed one last grand project, a final adventure to pour his formidable energy into. He turned his gaze back to Africa, the continent of his scientific triumph in the mountains of the moon. But this time, he came not as an explorer, but as a pioneer. He conceived of an audacious plan to create a model agricultural settlement in the arid lands of Italian Somaliland. Using a significant portion of his own personal fortune, he acquired a large tract of land near the Shabelle River. He brought in the best Italian engineers, agronomists, and colonists. They built a dam and a vast network of irrigation canals, transforming the dry scrubland into fertile fields. He founded a town, complete with a hospital, school, and church, and named it the Villaggio Duca degli Abruzzi, the village of the Duke of the Abruzzi. The project was, in many ways, a remarkable success. The colony became a thriving center for the production of sugar cane, bananas, and cotton, bringing modern agricultural science to the region. The Duke's vision was to create a self-sustaining, profitable, and enlightened community, a showcase of Italian innovation. However, it is impossible to view this final chapter of his life without acknowledging its complex and controversial nature. The Duke's village was at its core a colonial enterprise. It existed within the framework of Italy's African empire, an empire that was becoming increasingly aggressive under the rising influence of Benito Mussolini's fascist party. While the Duke was known for being a more humane and progressive administrator than many of his contemporaries, his project was still built on a colonial foundation of foreign rule and the use of local Somali labor. It was a utopian vision, but a utopia built on conquered land. This final act of his life embodies the contradictions of a man of the 19th century trying to build a perfect society in the morally complicated landscape of 20th century colonialism. He spent his final years devoted to this project, pouring the last of his energy into making his African dream a reality. It was a self-imposed exile, a final great adventure, far from the intrigues of the court that had caused him so much pain. As the great currents of the 20th century, war, revolution, and the rise of new ideologies, reshaped the world, the Duke of the Abruzzi lived out his final chapter in the African heat, a world away from the European courts of his birth. His village in Somalia became his final expedition, his last great project. It was here, in this remote outpost he had built from nothing, that we can step back and take the true measure of his extraordinary life. He had been an explorer, a lover, an admiral, and a pioneer. But what is his ultimate legacy? As an explorer and mountaineer, his place in history is secure and unassailable. He was a true giant of the heroic age. While some of his contemporaries were driven purely by the race for glory, the Duke's expeditions were distinguished by their scientific precision, their meticulous planning, and their consistent success. He didn't just plant flags, he created knowledge. His ascent of Mount St. Elias was a masterclass in logistics. His farthest north record, achieved through his leadership even after he was personally disabled, was a testament to his indomitable will. His comprehensive mapping of the Ruwenzori Mountains solved one of geography's last great mysteries. And then there is K2. While he never stood on its summit, his legacy on the Savage Mountain is perhaps more significant than that of many who did. The Abruzzi Spur is not just a name on a map, it is the living route, the path that, over a century later, still guides modern climbers on their own perilous ascents. It is a permanent testament to his vision, his judgment, and his pioneering spirit. In the pantheon of great explorers, he stands in the first rank, a man who combined the daring of a Scott or an Amundsen with the scientific mind of a true geographer. His legacy as a royal, however, is a far more tragic and personal story. The tale of his doomed love for Catherine Elkins is a heartbreaking illustration of the fundamental conflict that defined his life, the clash between personal happiness and the crushing weight of dynastic duty. His story reveals the immense human cost of the rigid, almost feudal codes that still governed European royalty at the turn of the century. The world was modernizing, But the ancient rules of blood purity and royal precedent held absolute sway. The Duke was a victim of this system, forced to sacrifice his own heart for the perceived good of a dynasty. His story, and that of the woman who waited for him, serves as a poignant epitaph for an entire class of people who were born into gilded cages, often denied the simple human freedoms they were supposedly born to protect. As a man of his time, he was a figure of immense contradictions. As an admiral, he served his country with distinction and courage, only to be cut down by the political intrigues he so despised. He was a man of action and bold strategies in an age that was increasingly run by cautious committees and backroom deals. And as a colonial pioneer, his legacy is inescapably complex. He was undoubtedly a visionary builder, transforming a harsh landscape with science and determination. But his noble vision was also an instrument of a colonial and later a fascist empire. His final great act, while impressive in its ambition, is a reminder that even the best intentions can be entangled in the problematic power structures of their time. The Duke of Abruzzi spent his last years dedicated entirely to his Somali village. He rarely returned to Italy. It was a self-imposed exile, but perhaps also a form of peace. He had found a place where he could build, lead, and create, free from the rigid constraints of the royal court that had brought him so much pain. He died there, in the village that bore his name, in March of 1933, and was buried in Somali soil as he had wished. In the end, Prince Luigi Amedeo's life was one of almost unparalleled achievement and profound personal loss. He was a man of action, intellect, and courage, a larger-than-life figure who seemed to belong to another era. He consistently rejected the comfort of his birthright, choosing instead to test himself against the most unforgiving environments on the planet. He conquered the physical world, charting its unknown corners and climbing its most difficult peaks. But his story is a powerful testament to the fact that the internal landscapes of love, duty, and regret are often the most challenging territories of all to navigate. He was a giant of his era, but also a deeply human and ultimately tragic figure, a man forever defined by both the incredible summits he reached and the one most important summit he was ever and always denied.